As you can see, we have amazing speakers in the back online already. And yeah, welcome to the second part of the meeting where we're now actually going to talk about CSW, Beijing +30, and reflecting on all of that. Just to give a little bit of context, which I know some of the speakers are also going to get into, as many of you, we probably feel like if we had a Beijing declaration these days, it wouldn't even be adopted. And it feels like we need to make the case that women's rights are human rights all over again, which is obviously very, very frustrating and very, very hard work. And it seems like with USAID, but also with the recent aid slashing in the UK, it kind of seems like we're beginning to witness the beginning of the end of global aid as we know it. So definitely unprecedented times. Obviously, rollback isn't something that just started yesterday, and it's something that feminist movements have been warning about and fighting for decades already. But to me, at least, it does seem like it is sort of unprecedented at this current moment. So yeah, instead of looking back on progress since Beijing, it feels like we have to ask ourselves, how do we fight back against this now in this moment? And so CSW is obviously happening in this context as well. And so we felt like all of this context is making it even more important to really think about how we engage strategically, what are our priorities, and how can we still advance those, and also make sure that we protect what we have from backlash, which is probably the biggest success that we might be able to get at all. And so today we're going to hear from feminist activists, and we'll take time to reflect, as I said, not just on priorities, but also on the challenges that we're facing and how we can move forward in this current moment together. And yeah, as I said, we're really grateful to be joined by an amazing lineup of speakers for today's meeting. And just to kind of set out what we're going to do in the second part of the meeting, we will hear from each of them. Then if we have time, we're going to do a little short panel discussion as well with some questions. Then we're going to open up for a Q&A so you all can ask your questions as well. And afterwards, in usual GADN manner, we're going to have some space and time for some breakout groups so you can all discuss amongst each other as well. So without further ado, I'm going to start with our amazing panel. And I'm going to just introduce them as we go along to save a little bit of time. So I'll first hand over to Brianna Howell. It's really weird to me that I can't look around to see them, but then I won't be able to speak into the mic, so we're going to have to handle it like this. First, hand over to Brianna, who is research analyst at UN Women. Brianna is one of the authors of the Secretary General's report on Beijing +30. And we're also lucky to be joined by Louis Williams, Brianna's colleague, who's also from the research and data section at UN Women, and is also co-author of this report, and that's the second Beijing report that Louis has been working on. And Louis is going to join us in the Q&A part. But yeah, as I said, first of all, I'm going to hand over to Brianna. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. Yes, so I am Brianna Howell from UN Women's Research and Data Team, and I'm very happy to be here today sharing a little bit about the Beijing report with you all here. Today, what we'll do is we'll set the scene for CSW, provide some key findings and highlights of the report, and then share UN Women's priorities for CSW. And next slide, please. So setting the scene, we all know that the Beijing Declaration was a visionary document representing a consensus of 189 countries to take action on gender equality, ensuring that women and girls were brought into the development agenda. It was adopted at a time of hope and solidarity with this consolidation and strengthening of democracies and human rights institutions in many areas of the world. And 30 years later, though times have changed, it does continue to mobilize member states, the UN system, civil society, and push activists and all of us to keep pushing forward on gender equality. Next slide, please. Yet, as we're approaching this 30th anniversary, the agenda is more precarious than ever, with an unprecedented pushback against gender equality going hand in hand with democratic erosion. Some states are explicitly using misogyny and gender inequality as a governing strategy, promoting legal reforms that have narrow definitions of traditional families, limiting the use of even the concept of gender in policy documents, legislation, and research, and all while curtailing reproductive rights and the rights and protection for gender and other minority groups. And in 2023, nearly half of all countries saw some form of democratic decline, including the closure of civic spaces, which are essential for women and girls' ability to make their voices heard and hold leaders accountable. This is all in a broader context of ongoing crises: COVID-19, climate change, inflation, and conflicts. Next slide, please. And this context is where we write the Beijing +30 report, and it provides a big overall update on where gender equality stands today. 159 countries contributed to this report through surveys and narrative documents detailing their actions to advance the Beijing platform over the past 5 years. We combine this with cutting-edge data and research from UN Women and others on global trends and emerging issues. We conducted consultations with experts in civil society, academia, and activists, and regional commissions informed the report, as well as the political declaration, which is currently under development. All of this led to a 115-page Secretary General report and a forthcoming summary version, which will be launched last week. And now I will highlight some key findings for us. Next slide, please. All right. So most states reported taking action in these key priority areas over the past 5 years: ending violence against women and girls, equality under the law and access to justice, political participation, education and training, and access to healthcare, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. Next slide. And we saw promising areas of progress and new policy directions emerging. For instance, 90% of states took action to eliminate violence against women and girls. 79% of states strengthened their social protection systems, and 2/3 strengthened care services for older people. And there's been a 10-point increase in the number of states taking action to expand women's access to natural resources. Next slide. But we also saw limited progress or stagnation in many areas, especially in the last 5 years. Women's labor force participation has been stagnant for 2 decades, with 63% of women employed compared to 92% of men, along with the persistent wage gap. Roughly 10% of women and girls still live in extreme poverty worldwide, which, though this is a slight improvement, would still require 137 years to eradicate. The rate of women's participation in parliaments has more than doubled since 1995, now reaching 27%. But at this rate, we still will not see parity until 2063. And those facing multiple and intersecting inequalities often experience heightened injustices across all areas. For example, 84% of multidimensionally poor people live in rural areas, and LGBTIQ women face heightened risks of violence and harassment. Next slide. And so the full analysis revealed these key 5 bottlenecks and trends. So number 1, there is a widening accountability gap for gender equality, with democratic erosion, growing polarization, and mobilization of anti-rights actors leading to increase the attacks on women in public life, and there's fewer opportunities for justice and for accountability. Number 2, this growing backlash weakens the institutions that were created and enabled progress on gender equality through their systematic defunding, undermining, restructuring, or dismantling. Number 3, we have not seen adequate investment in solutions, even in places where policy solutions already exist. 4, technical advances do hold potential for gender equality and for the development agenda, but we are seeing the emergence of new risks, such as online gender-based violence. And finally, demographic patterns demand transformative changes. For example, young women require new and more jobs and opportunities, particularly as part of a green transition, and aging populations across the world require more investments in care systems. Next slide. And so based on all this evidence and analysis that we collected as part of the report process and in consultation with our partners, UN Women has identified an action agenda with 6 priority areas to deliver results and drive progress. These are as follows. Number 1, a digital revolution. 2, freedom from poverty. 3, zero violence. 4, full and equal decision-making power. 5, peace and security. And 6, climate justice. And the next slide. And that's it for me. Thank you. I just wanted to keep a very, very high level today as an overview of the introduction to the report, and happy to answer any other questions you have during the Q&A. So thank you all for your attention and your important work. We look forward to further discussions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Brianna, for setting that context and sharing the findings from the report. I think looking at that action agenda now, it will be interesting to think about where can we actually still see that sort of progress. It seems less and less likely, but really good to see that all set out. And I'm sure we're going to talk about it more as part of the Q&A. So next up, I'm going to hand over to Shripra Berlonguel, who is Global Advocacy Officer at FOS Feminista. And as many of you might know, who are also engaging as part of the space, FOS Feminista are also co-conveners of the Women's Rights Caucus. And Shripra is going to talk us through priorities of the caucus for this year and also their work on CSW revitalization. Over to you, and thank you for being with us today.
No, thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. Hi, everyone. I'm Shifra, pronouns she, they. I'm with FOS. And FOS Feminista is an international alliance for sexual and reproductive health rights and justice of women, girls, and gender diverse people. We work with over 70 institutional partners in the Global South and more as like allies, and work across SRHR advocacy, service provision, and education. Can we go to the next slide?
Just 1 second, we're having some tech problems.
Okay, great. And then the next. So as was mentioned, FOS Feminista is a co-convener of the Women's Rights Caucus, and the Women's Rights Caucus is basically a self-organized space for feminist civil society advocates that want to do collective advocacy around CSW. So we have really like a year-long kind of cycle of work, and we get particularly activated like the second half of the year in preparation for March when CSW happens. And what we do is we come together, collectively reflect and strategize around whatever the priority theme is for that year, make language recommendations once we have the different drafts of the draft agreed conclusions, and also do direct advocacy at the UN with missions, and because we have such a broad membership, some of our members also do advocacy with member states at Capitol or are part of delegations that come to CSW. So we're about like 800 in our listserv right now, organizations and advocates in the Women's Rights Caucus. Our other co-conveners in the WRC are Asia Pacific Women and Women Forum for Law and Development, Femnet, Young Feminist Caucus, and Outright. Okay. Yeah, so this year, because it's an anniversary year, and I think we maybe all know already that there'll be two resolutions that will be taken up. First is the political declaration, and then the other one is the multi-year program of work. I'm gonna take up the political declaration first, just to kind of give you like a sense of what that means for us and how we might do advocacy in an anniversary year. So the political declaration is not like your usual resolution. Like on a normal year, you would have something like agreed conclusions, which is meant to address a particular priority theme or like issue area. With the political declaration, it's really about kind of laying out like high-level priorities of member states as kind of a recommitment for member states to the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action and the gender equality agenda broadly, and to kind of update with emerging issues. And yeah, so that's kind of how it's different from like your normal year of agreed conclusions. And I think I could go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of sort of the timeline we have for the political declaration. we anticipate that the political declaration will be adopted on the first day of CSW. So actually, a lot of the work in terms of advocacy would have already been done by CSW. And right now we are, I think, Rev 2 has just come out. And you know what the Women's Rights Caucus does every time a draft resolution comes out or a draft revision comes out is we do like kind of language markup. So we make like direct suggestions on the text and circulate that with like supportive member states. And yeah, and just to maybe speak to kind of the different areas we cover, like I said, we're a pretty big coalition. It's not really a big tent coalition in the sense that we also like kind of have some principles that people have to sign on to be able to join the Women's Rights Caucus. And people sort of have to be vetted, but like I said, we're 800. So I guess it's like a lot of people are I guess the world is small, no, when it comes to gender equality. But just to say, so we get a lot of input from a lot of people across different issues. And for this year, we comment on things from economic justice, climate justice, diversity, SRHR, education, gender-based violence, resourcing and financing, digitalization, data and evidence, youth, adolescent and girls, aging, disability justice, political participation, and civil society participation. Okay. And just to give you like kind of a broad sense of like what our actual priorities are for this year, I think, you know, it was mentioned earlier, we're finding ourselves in a very difficult moment. So it's very important for us to like not regress from agreed language in the previous political declaration, but also to bring back progressive language from 10 years ago, because is language there that's actually more progressive than 5 years ago. And I think like that might not come as a surprise to all of us. Okay. And then some of the things that we want to see, the 5 R's of care economy, loss and damage when it comes to climate. We're an SRHR org. We really want to make sure that references to SRHR stay, references to UHC, and of course, like references to multiple intersecting forms of discrimination, vulnerability, and violence. We want inclusion of older women as well as adolescents, youth, and of course, to make sure that the role of civil society is recognized, and also for there to be some language around funding civil society to do the work that we do. Okay. There's so much more, and if you get involved in the Women's Rights Caucus, then definitely you'll be able to learn more about like our priorities, but also like if you join, you'll have like real-time updates of where we are in terms of like the different revisions, and you'll know kind of where to push your member states on in real time. So I think we are way ahead. Could we go back to like the multi-year program of work slide? Okay. So the other resolution that's gonna be taken up this year is the multi-year program of work, which basically, because it's an anniversary year, a new cycle of CSW starts from next year, and this is where kind of the priority themes for the next 5 years are proposed. So, for example, some of the priority themes for the substantive years, which are the normal years, no? For the 77th session, it's on care systems. For the 70th, it's on care systems. 71st, it's on the SDGs. And for the 72nd, it's on humanitarian emergencies. And 73rd is on women's access to justice. Okay. Yeah, you can attend the Women's Rights Caucus online, so you can follow the CSW process actually online through the Women's Rights Caucus, and I'll be sharing the link to join in a bit. All right, next slide. Yeah, another thing, although a resolution on it isn't going to be adopted at CSW, but it will be taken up, or at least we anticipate that there'll be some conversation or dialogues that will be organized in relation to it, is CSW revitalization, which is a process that member states and, with the support of UN Women and the UN infrastructure are leading to basically improve the CSW process. And so the Women's Rights Caucus, to influence this process, came up with like a document of recommendations based on a survey and consultations that we did with our members. So the recommendations we developed um, came out can be categorized into three pillars. First is accountability, second, feminist leadership and civil society participation, and third, responding to urgent and emergent issues and crises. And I'll just really quickly breeze through the recommendations to just show you. So these are our recommendations. Next slide. Yeah, some of the things that we want member states to consider is to take inspiration from best practices in other UN processes like COP, HLPF. We want the CSW process to be more decentralized and for the regional CSW processes to be supported more and strengthened and better connected to the global process. And we also want rotational regional hosting of the CSW, or if or to make the New York headquarters more accessible if that's not possible. Next slide. Yeah, of course, support civil society participation, address kind of the lack of interactive opportunities and the hybrid model, and yes, make sure that there are ways for civil society to engage member states ahead of the process. And then other things include also making sure visa access is addressed and more people marginalized communities and feminist activists from the Global South are supported to join. Other things include making sure that the thematic focus of CSW can be determined through an open process, so it's more relevant to the lived realities of women and girls everywhere. Next slide. And how do you join the WRC? I'm gonna share the link on chat. I didn't realize this would be a hybrid session, so I'm just gonna share the link on chat, and hopefully the folks from GADN can share it out to you all. And yeah, I think that's my presentation. Thank you so much, and I hope I see you all at the WRC and at CSW.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Shipra, for setting all of that out. And I think it will be an interesting moment also to see in the current time if maybe there will at least be some space to look at some of that wider ranging work that Shipra was talking about in terms of the revitalization that would make CSW a more democratic, potentially, space. And we'll definitely share the link for people who are interested in joining the caucus as well after the meeting. Next up, we have Nicole Maloba, who is joining us from Femnet. Nicole is Economic Justice and Rights Lead at Femnet. And Nicole and Femnet folks have been conducting extensive Beijing +30 consultations across the African continent. And so she's going to share some of those priorities with us today. Thank you, Nicole, and over to you.
Thanks for that, Yamina. And greetings to everyone who's in the room and those who are with me online. So just briefly, I wanted to be able to share with you the work that we've been doing around working our way up to, of course, the Beijing +30 review at CSW69. So just briefly, for those of you who might not be familiar with Femnet, Femnet is the African Women's Development and Communication Network, and we are a membership-based network organization where we have over 800 individual and institutional members across 50 African countries. So that's how far and wide our reach is. And mainly our work is around, of course, making sure to be able to dismantle, systems of power, structural injustices, oppression that lies at the heart of feminism. And how we do this is, of course, through advocacy, capacity building. We do this also through knowledge generation by always making sure that we contribute to feminist knowledge, and decolonial feminist knowledge for that matter, for the continent, within the continent, for the wider civil society space. And we believe, of course, that African women and girls thrive in dignity and well-being, free from patriarchal and neoliberal oppression and injustices. So our mission, you can see it there if you can have a look. I won't touch too much onto this, but if you'd like to be able to follow the work that we do, which mainly stems not only from economic justice and rights, but all the way to SRHR, to climate justice, to young women and girls, and to women in transformational leadership. Yeah. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yes. So over the last year, 2024, once, of course, we knew the theme for CSW69, we were very keen on trying to see and document the progress of the Beijing Declaration in the continent for the last 30 years. And so we took on a mission to be able to have sub-regional consultations in the 5 sub-regions in the continent to be able to make sure that we're able to hear straight from the horse's mouth, the women and the young girls in terms of what are the challenges, what are the things they consider as wins, looking at the Beijing Declaration, trying to figure out whether this actually represents where we are in 30 years later. And what we were really keen was to try and find out whether the critical areas of the Beijing Declaration still represent the critical areas that what women actually need in society today through all the spheres. But if not, then what are the emerging issues, which are also what we really wanted to be able to tackle on. And so at some point, we also wanted to see if we're sort of reimagining and had the opportunity to sort of look at the Beijing Declaration post 30 years. What would that look like? And would women and girls read it and feel that they're represented by those critical areas? So, of course, we had 13 consultations across Africa with a total reach of 3,136. You can see the 5 regional consultations which we took on. We had 3 physical ones, which was Southern Africa, we did Central Africa, we did East Africa, and the final consultations, which was the regional now consultation, which culminated in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And then we had one virtual one for West Africa. Of course, in addition to the CSO consultations, we're being very tactful and making sure that's an intergenerational approach to the consultation. So we also had 5 youth consultations. Most of them were hybrid, but we were able to also have some of them virtual, and of course also using modern media such as TikTok and Twitter Spaces to be able to make sure we get as many people. And then we did have 3 general CSO consultations, which was at the Gender is My Agenda campaign in Ghana, and these were also virtual. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the impacts of how far we reached when we were doing all these consultations. These are just some of them. I won't go through all of them, but you can just have a look. And in terms of the reaches that we had, of course, we get more reach with when the consultations are virtual, especially using social media, because especially with Twitter Spaces, we found it very engaging in terms of people could actually tune in even though they were doing other things and contribute to like the chat processes and also contribute to the questions and the conversation. And of course, the challenging, even within the continent, we also have the same challenges of trying to get to places. And so would have, of course, more limitations in terms of the physical consultations, but we were still able to try and loop that gap the best we could. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is also some of the reach. You can see our largest was the physical consultations, the culmination in Addis Ababa, which was the last one we had in October for the regional consultations. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are all the countries in attendance and the numbers of countries. So in total, we were able to reach 46 countries with the consultations out of the 55 countries that we have in the continent. Next slide, please. Yeah, this was also the regional representation. Next slide, please. Yes. So, as I was mentioning, one of the key objectives of why we wanted to have the consultations was to make sure we're able to we wanted to be able to have the outcome of drafting position statements. And we wanted the position statements to be advised and to be co-authored by African women and girls themselves. And so in order to do this process, that's why we had to go back to the drawing board and make sure we do a lot of consultations to be able to make sure we document all the inputs that they had. In that process, we came up with a CSO position statement, and we also came up with a draft youth position statement, which was done by, of course, African youth ranging from 30, I don't think 30 and below. They were all 30 and below. And these position statements are the position statements which have also culminated in contributing to the outcome of the CSO parallel report, which we will also be launching at CSW69. So just to mention a bit of the emerging issues, remember I told you in the beginning, we really wanted to be able to look at whether the Beijing Declaration represents what African women and girls need 30 years later in terms of the critical areas. Of course, by all means, we do respect the work that our sisters who came before us took in terms of being able to give us that, framework, which has actually been really instrumental in advancing women's rights. But of course, in the process of that, a lot of things change, and we were really keen on trying to see whether this fits. So some of the emerging issues that came out of the consultations was, of course, there's an emergence of new forms of violations of women's rights that might not be looked at within the 12 critical areas of the Beijing. And so we felt that it might not have been anticipated by the Beijing platform commitments or the present iteration of legal frameworks such as femicide, honor killings, technology facilitated exploitation, but all this, of course, intersect with the systemic barriers to gender equality. We also noted, of course, the rollback and the backlash against women's rights and gender equality and inclusive governance systems across the African continent due to, of course, fundamentalism and conservatism globally. A lot of things have been deprioritized in the continent in terms of advancing women's rights. And as a result, that has also regressed some of the wins that we had made, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, there's an increased burden of unpaid care work and domestic work, a lot of precarious employment. There's little to no decent work. And so that was something which was also emerging. Then, of course, there was also a growing insecurity of women land rights and the limited control over natural resources for women and girls. I'll just use the example like what we went through in Kenya with the finance bill, which I'm sure you're also in the news trending at some point. And some of those like austerity measures which were being implemented really also were geared towards making sure that land rights were even becoming more difficult to be able to attain for women and girls. Just the few, only in Kenya at this point, only 1% of the land is owned by women. And so that can show you how far that and wide that gap is, and the policies that the government was trying to put forward included, for example, making land making freehold titles leasehold titles, which already makes it more difficult for women to even be able to access that land, buy that land, and have control over that land. Next, please. Yeah, so of course, I've shared some of the emerging issues, but I also told you that we did have the position statements. So some of the demands that came out of the consultations, both the Africa CSO and the youth demands include, of course, to be able to develop national care and domestic work policies. Social reproduction has been on the rise, and we've been trying to move towards, of course, demanding that there's a lot of domestic resource mobilization that actually goes around public service delivery and financing, including, of course, looking at domestic work, migrant workers, the labor sector, looking at the gig economy as well, which a lot of women have actually been going into now, to be able to enable them to have the flexibilities to be able to bear that burden of unpaid care work. You can see also increased migrant workers' participation in unions and associations to ensure their voice is heard in social dialogue processes. And then just next slide. Yeah, of course, I mentioned the domestic resource mobilization. Of course, debt cancellation strategies is very, very big for us. A lot of countries are actually having a lot of debt burden. And of course, the austerity measures still continue, which actually hinder the advancement of specific services, which can actually be able to enable women to attain their socioeconomic rights. And then, of course, prevent illicit financial flows. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we are currently working, as I said, on a common position statement within the CSO parallel report, which we will be launching at CSW. And because, of course, we acknowledge that a lot of spaces are multilateral processes, there's need to be able to sensitize a lot of member states on the CSO statements and the youth position statement, just so that they can be able to know what is African women and girls' demands in terms of the Beijing +30 process and what governments can actually incorporate. Next slide, please. Yes, so lastly, I'll just finish off with this point, which is Femnet has been hosting the Africa Disrupt since actually 2022, which was the first. And just as my colleague from Force Feminista mentioned, we've also been pushing back in terms of trying to get, of course, an advocate for a rotational CSW, just to be able to make sure that the space is more inclusive and to open up the shrinking civic space for participation. And so even this year, as we speak, my colleagues are in Botswana hosting the Africa Disrupt. And the objectives of that is, of course, the implementation framework, looking at the commitments to get commitments from member states for the implementation framework for the political declaration, revitalization of CSW, and then, of course, the rollout of advocacy tools for implementation of the political declaration. We're very tactful to be able to host it in Botswana because, as my colleague mentioned, Botswana is one of the countries which will contribute to that conversation. And of course, to be able to validate the CSO and youth position statement and the CSO parallel report. So there's a lot of work, of course, which goes into convening and trying to be able to make sure the inputs of the position statements are also legitimized by the voices of who we work for and who we represent. And so in terms of decolonizing that process, that's why we undertook taking on the sub-regional consultations to be able to advise the final outcome. So I'll just stop there for now. And I'm happy to chat further if you have any other questions.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nicole. Really, really impressive work. Thank you for sharing. I feel really bad moving people on, and I know we never have enough time to hear everybody at length, but I also want to make sure that we still have some time for Q&A afterwards. So swiftly, I'm going to move over to Heather to my right, who is Senior Policy and Advocacy Manager at Plan International UK. And Heather's going to talk us through Plan's priorities for CSW this year, as well as share an update on negotiations. Yeah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much to everyone online, everyone in the room. Not sure quite why I'm up here, but it is a pleasure. I was in a meeting recently, maybe some of you were, where someone was talking about 30 years ago, the UK government paid for loads of people to go on a train from Poland to Beijing, and there was a feminist library on board. Which sounds really nice and very different from this year's gift, which is slashing of funds for work and programs with communities around the globe. So we're in a really different place, aren't we? Anyway, next slide. You don't need this context, but because you know it, and maybe the vibrant colours help. I don't know. But we are at a critical time. We've been talking about rights for ages. It feels more critical than ever when we think back to where we were 30 years ago. But I think one of the things to say is that our work is important, and also to remember what has been achieved and that we can still create change. And perhaps sometimes showing up is the important thing. And maybe that's what CSW is about this year. Next slide. But also there, you know, because it is an important civic space. We know it is shrinking. We know the UN itself is under attack. Reform is overdue and needed, but at the moment it is one of the spaces where governments and civil society do get together. I think we're there to make sure that we can provide opportunities specifically for the women and girls that we work with, those people that are on the front line of activism. If someone like me is not, I've got some wonderful people, Chetna and Holly, that I took to the UN last year for CPD. So that is an important space for them to meet and engage with those decision makers and share their priorities and recommendations themselves. So we are working and taking, not Plan UK, just us, but working with the Federation, 24 youth advocates at national, regional and global level. We've been working with them to influence their national governments, and some of them, 16 of them, will be coming to CSW. We'll be doing all the things that many of you will already be doing in CSW, so I won't kind of go through them. But if it's not a space you've been in, there's some information up there about some of the things we'll be doing. But it's also a space, isn't it, for solidarity and support at this time. And I think, yeah, being there to listen to some of the debates, some of the ideas that are coming up in this time and how we can work together. Next slide, please. So, yeah, do you know what? This is really kind of a rambling of what I might want, we might want the government to do and start focusing on now. It's kind of, yeah, has changed several times in the last week and a half. But essentially, we can't ignore that there is a critical funding gap. And even if the government is cutting, there are things that they can do. They can protect the gender budget. They can get the money from the football club that they're selling and put it in the right place. You know, we can look at their talks on getting financing from private sources. We can, you know, push that call for money to go directly to feminist groups. So there is a lot more that we can do, but also we need them to keep up that political support, that political championing of rights as well. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was really, really helpful. I'm always sorry to move people on, as I said, but we are running out of time a little bit, unfortunately. So I'm also going to have to cut the panel discussion short. I had a couple of questions prepared, but instead, I think you all probably have questions for the panel as well. So I would like to move into that now. Please just raise your hand and then I'm going to come to you with a mic so they can hear you online as well. Don't be shy. Okay, for people online who can't see, people are, oh, there we go.
Thank you so much, all of you. I was really pleased to hear older women mentioned and the recognition that demographic change is something that needs to be taken seriously when we're having these discussions around CSW. My question for UN Women, but really for the whole panel, is how can we make sure that older women from low and middle income contexts, I'm talking about specifically, are made more visible and their voices and experiences taken into account in these discussions, because they've been historically they have been overlooked, and make sure that crucially they're seen as active agents of change, not just seen for their, it is important to see the vulnerabilities and the need for investment in care as well. So it's both sides. How can we recognise their agency and the contributions they have and their investment in their communities and in the future, as well as their risks. Thank you.
Thank you. Kate, did you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. My question is to Natalie, I think, from Femnet, and to Plan. So it's how do we plug the participants we have that are attending, CSW into the Young Feminist Caucus? That's my question. And then, is there a plan by the network to have an inventory of all activities, or at least some kind of a spreadsheet where we can all just plug in what we are doing and then connect from there, because that could be useful instead of trying to recall everyone who mentioned that they will be at CSW. But then also, I think whenever I'm in this space, I ask myself what we means, So when we're speaking about us and we are going to be doing this, what does that really mean? Whose voice are we really centering? And who's getting the platforms and the space and the rooms? Maybe this is also a reflection to myself that the in-betweens between CSW are not as strong as they can be, because sometimes we've got multiple research documents on the same thing that come up and multiple advocacy positions, done by different entities, of course, all of them valid, but not as coordinated. And then when we're at CSW, if a young person is attending CSW for the first time, they can get lost in the space. But we've got allies here who've been in the space for a long time. How do we just make those spaces more accessible? And before we even start thinking about CSW revitalization, what are we doing as holders of those spaces, such as the Women's Caucus, for example, to ensure that we are strengthening, engagement of, let's say, newcomers, for lack of a better word, but that have a very valued voice and a right to be in those spaces. So how are we just really reconciling those processes? And then Natalie, I work with your colleagues, Maureen. Memory is a personal friend of mine, the director of Femnet. We will be at CSW. Please look for me, find me. I'll try to find you as well, because we just don't really want to get to doors that are locked by allies who are feminists because we didn't know about them, So that's just my plea, and for us to just really coordinate what we'll do there.
Sorry. Proximity. Maybe just a question, but more of a comment on to our panelists from UN Women. So noting the last slide on the Beijing +30 action agenda. So I note that freedom from poverty is mentioned, but freedom from poverty is also about changing the macroeconomic system. So how does UN Women see this action being taken forward, if anything, following on from the spirit of collaboration and not just putting reports out there, collaborating across the multilateral system, right? So what are some of the intentions around that?
Yeah. Claudia, did anybody else have a question?
Hi, I have 3 questions, but the first one's sort of just administrative, which is the Beijing 30 report that was presented at the beginning. Is that out in public yet, or is that publicly available? Okay, can someone link me that? Because I tried to Google it and I could not find it. Secondly, my question was on the states reporting the action that they'd pushed forward on preventing violence against women. Was that primarily sort of legislative criminalization action, or was there also were they reporting increased investments in evidence-based prevention interventions? And then final question is for Heather, which is on, I guess, really disappointing to hear that the UK has not been using its voice as strongly as it could and should be. Who are the actors and states that are speaking out more loudly? As the UK keeps going on about how it's going to form new partnerships, et cetera, who do you actually see the countries that are being brave and speaking out that the UK should be considering forging those partnerships with?
Thank you.
Thanks all for your questions. You were shy at the start, but I knew you had some. Thank you. Okay, let me see how we can, I don't know, how we can sort this a little bit in the interest of time as well. So maybe we can start with the question around younger feminists and newcomers, as you mentioned, how we can plug those into the space and also support them if they go to CSW. Shripra, could I direct that question to you? And maybe you could also touch on the point around whose voices are we centering and on which platforms, and how we kind of go about the coordination to make sure that multiple potentially different advocacy positions aren't contradicting each other. Loads of questions, but over to you.
Yeah, hi again. So one of the co-conveners of the Women's Rights Caucus is the Young Feminist Caucus, and that's how we work with young feminists. You know, like we organize like orientation sessions, language advocacy training, opposition monitoring training, safety and with like some safety and security components. Because we recognize that a lot of the people that come to the CSW space include like young feminists. And you know, they're part of the decision making like every step of the way. But yeah, but they're kind of the primary channel for which yeah, youth, like they're who we direct youth activists to to for them to join like the Young Feminist Caucus. And yeah, I think we're pretty coordinated in that sense. Another co-convener we have outright is also a co-convener of the LBTI caucus. And therefore there's also kind of like a partnership with like the LBTI caucus. The other co-conveners like Femnet that's here and APWLD. Meanwhile, like our regional co-conveners because they cover Asia Pacific and Africa. So yeah, I feel like we are very intentional about making sure that the decision-making group, the co-conveners, is like representative of like caucuses and like geographies, and also just making sure that there's like built-in capacity strengthening when you're engaging the Women's Rights Caucus. Again, like I said, we have a very kind of like we have I feel like it's a big constituency. And I think there's a reason why people come to the space, you know. I don't know if like I missed the question. I missed like any like question or like anything like within that question. But yeah, also like we try our best to like kind of coordinate with UN Women, influence some of the consultation and interactive processes. Like FOSS and Young Feminist Caucus have been working together, for example, in the language advocacy training that's being run by UN Women right now. Yeah, so I think we're just trying our best to like reach as much people. For this year, we're actually supporting I think like 5 or 6 young people with travel grants because we receive funding, and actually like most of our funding has gone to that, and we're hoping to like be able to sustain that in like the next years as well.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Shipra. And Nicole, I see you have your hand up, and that's very handy because I wanted to ask you anyway about the question on whose voices do we center and where do we platform people and how do we give that access. But also if you wanted to touch on something else, please feel free to come in. Over to you, Nicole.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why my camera is acting up all of a sudden. Okay. Thanks for that. Yeah, so in terms of whose voices do we center, for us in Femnet, the way we work around is we're very keen on being able to share the lived realities of African women and girls. And so it's very important for us to be able to put them in instances and opportunities and platforms to be able to share their lived realities, and how those lived realities can then be able to influence or even create new policies. And so when, for example, I use the term we and us, I use the term not as Nicole or Femnet, but I use the term as Nicole, who's an African young woman, who's a millennial, who has her lived realities of whether it's elderly care, unpaid care, and that is my positionality as an African woman. And so as I say us and we, I refer to my sisters within the continent, and that's how for us we center and who centers in our work. In terms of also including also on the question on including older women, we do a lot of intergenerational dialogues, and even with our consultations, what we're really keen on, we even brought pioneers who were there in Beijing when it was being drafted and lobbying around this, African women who contributed to the conversation then, and they were able to speak with, you know, Gen Zs in terms of the challenges that they were fighting for, and how Gen Zs can be able to contribute to that, but also share and exchange. And whenever we have those intergenerational dialogues, that actually also contributes to making sure that there's a knowledge exchange. There's also reverse peer learning, but also peer learning from the people who came, the women who came before us. So that's how we are able to engage and make sure that older women are actually contributing to the conversation. On the question on how, of course, sometimes we find ourselves with also other civil society or women's rights organizations when it comes to knowledge production, that you're all having a lot of documentation, which is actually alluding to the same issue. And so what we've also been doing of late is we have a lot of collaborative processes. So we work with our other allies and women's rights organizations to be able to come up with position statements. So even like the Africa Disrupt, we do convene, for example, with Action Aid Africa, Christian Aid Africa, Akina Mama wa Africa, other women's rights organizations, because going together, sometimes we also see the force of the energy of going together as a group as opposed to going as an individual. And there's strength in solidarity, and feminist solidarity for that matter. And so we do a lot of collaborative efforts for that. And so a lot of times you will see a lot of the documentation that now comes up, it's like a paper by Femnet and other feminist, African feminist organizations. On the question on how to support young women who are coming. Again, I think Shipra touched on that with the Young Women's Caucus. For us also, something that we also do, we also have information sessions for our members who are engaging at CSW, and even those who are engaging at CSW virtually. We're always having constant information sessions. So if someone has registered to be a member of Femnet, those are some of the information they would always get like on a newsletter, but it's also normally public, which we put up on our social media. So even if someone is not a member, they'll be able to register and access those information sessions to continuously update them on what's happening, which document has come out, how can they input into documentation if they're not engaging in those processes. But most importantly, like something which we also started instituting now, we've done it for 5 years now, is we also have mentorship platforms for people who are engaging in CSW that they've never engaged before. Because of course we said that the civic space is actually shrinking. We all know that of course we only get 20 slots per organization. Those 20 slots, you can imagine if you have 800 members, you have to really, you know, everyone is pushing, trying to be able to get. So we even have to at times find ourselves literally beg our allies who might have the budgets and the accessibility, but they don't have support to be able to support people, to make sure we can be able to support as many people as possible to engage in the process. But whenever they get there, because we always have new people who this is maybe their first time engaging, we have a hand holding where it's sort of like a big sister, little sister sort of platform, whereby if it's your first time, you can always reach out, for example, to the Femnet delegation and be like, hey, we have a girl who's joining CSW for this first time. Can you show her around, even from just giving them induction to how to get to the UN Women building, from which street, etc. Those small acts of my sister's keeper is what we actually also institute in their ways of working to make sure that people know how to navigate the processes technically, but also in the little physical components of engaging in CSW. Yeah, I'll just stop there for now, but I hope that answers some of your questions. So thank you very much. Primrose, please reach out to us. I will also tell Memory and Maureen I met you here, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at CSW.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nicole. We got thumbs up. Questions were answered. That was really comprehensive and super, super helpful. And I love that you also think about not just the big picture, but also the small things and the care that we need to give each other in such spaces. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to go to the questions that we got directed at UN Women. So Brianna and Louis, if that's okay. What am I doing here? Sorry. So there was one question around the point around freedom from poverty and if UN Women is also looking at changing the macroeconomic and macro level economic system. So that was one. Then there was a question about the report being out already, which I think we've answered, but if you wanted to say anything more about that, feel free. And then the last question was around preventing violence against women and girls and if that was mainly around legislative action or also increased investment. So those three, over to both of you. I don't know who wants to come in.
I'm happy to start. I'll kind of touch on the later questions, I think. So in regards to the report, the advanced draft version is out, and I believe the official version will be out next week, but the full 115 pages is available online, and we can absolutely share links to that. In terms of the national reporting on gender-based violence, so the question about, is gender-based violence a priority? That's like the biggest bucket of gender-based violence, and that includes any actions taken on it, whether preventative or in terms of justice or legal systems. So that's why we had that high percentage rate of response of 90% of countries responding some action there. But we do have questions that go more in depth on gender-based violence specifically. So in those ones look at, what were the top specific actions that you took, whether it's creating new laws, developing action plans, improving access to justice, services for survivors, strengthen prevention strategies, or monitoring and evaluation. So we kind of look at it very comprehensively in the report, but there's obviously different levels of responses to all those, but we do consider all of those in a multifaceted way. And then just briefly on the question related to transformation and what that looks like, I think UN Women does have a very transformative and kind of comprehensive economic approach and vision for this. We are going to be looking at promoting greater use of public services, stronger and more robust public services, and social protection infrastructure. And I think here I can pass over to Louis to kind of talk a little bit more about the social protection side of it and other economic policies.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here just from a personal perspective as a Brit, but I've been at UN Women in New York for about 7 years now. So thanks for having me. I think just in terms of the macroeconomics point and the, seeing poverty as requiring these more structural shifts and that more holistic perspective, I think I fully agree. And I think in the research team, we're all fully on board with, the need to identify those more structural roots of poverty. I think in the Beijing report, the global report, I hope you will see some of that more structural analysis coming through in the section on poverty eradication. I know, for instance, that we talk about how mounting debt and austerity prevents needed investment in social protection and public services. We also make some references to expenditure on armed conflict. But I think more generally, across the different reports that our section puts out, there can be different opportunities to maybe go a little further or to say different things or take a deeper dive into different things. So also wanted to point you towards a recent report we put out on social protection, gender responsive social protection, called the World Survey on the Role of Women in Development. I think, in there we go into, the financing needed for comprehensive social protection across the life course, including, to speak to another point, touching on older women specific needs when it comes to social protection. And I will also suggest that you look at another report on feminist climate justice, where we have language on reparations. We also have, explicit acknowledgement that economic prosperity in high-income countries today was built on colonization, enslavement, and exploitation of people and natural resources in the global south. And mentioned that the contemporary architecture of international finance has been critiqued as a form of neocolonialism. So suggest you take a look at those reports too. Yes, I'll end here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Louis, for those reports as well. That sounds super interesting. Thank you both. And that unfortunately leads us to the end of the Q&A and the panel. I know we would have all loved to discuss more and hear more from our amazing speakers, but just a huge, huge thank you to Shripra, to Heather, to Brianna, to Louis, and also to Nicole, of course. If you want to do a little round of applause, hopefully you can hear that online. Thank you so, so much. Okay, we can end the Teams call now. Thank you again. Hopefully see you all soon.